Hello, everybody. I'm Stephanie Haney, and thank you for being here for this special election 2022 edition of Legally Speaking. This midterm election is shaping up to be a close one in the U.S. House and the Senate, and we're all watching to see where the balance of power shifts. Will it switch to the Republicans? Will it end up more strongly in favor of the Democrats, who right now control both houses of Congress and the presidency? Only time will tell for sure, but here's a breakdown of what usually happens in a midterm election and which races are most likely to decide the outcome this year. Midterm elections get that name because they're considered to sort of check in on how the president is doing in the middle of a four-year term. And there is a lot at stake right now for Democrats, since they control the presidency, the House of Representatives, and the Senate. Although you wouldn't know it by the amount of legislation they've been able to pass. That's because control in the Senate is so narrow. It's actually split 50-50, and the Democrats only have control by virtue of Vice President Kamala Harris's tie-breaking vote. And that is not enough of a margin to overcome the filibuster rule, which requires 60 votes to end debate before legislation can move to a final vote. That's the issue Democrats have been dealing with for 2 years. But now there are 35 seats up for election in the Senate, and all 435 are on the ballot in the House. And depending on how these elections go, the parties in power could change. There are really 6 major elections to watch in the Senate that it could impact who holds power for the rest of President Joe Biden's term. Those races are in Georgia between Raphael Warnock and Herschel Walker, Pennsylvania between John Fetterman and Dr. Mehmet Oz, Nevada between Catherine Cortez Masto and Adam Laxalt, Arizona between Mark Kelly and Blake Masters, Ohio between Tim Ryan and J.D. Vance, and Wisconsin between Lieutenant Governor Mandela Barnes and Ron Johnson. There'll be hard-fought battles between the candidates you hear, and potentially making for a long election night for each of their campaigns. In the House, where the margin is larger for Democrats, it's actually more likely power flips to Republicans. Going into this election, Democrats hold 220 seats and Republicans hold 212, with 3 vacancies where 1 person passed away and 2 people have resigned. So the Democrats have the majority by 8 seats. Now, it's sort of a general rule that whichever party doesn't hold the presidency will pick up seats in the House in the midterm elections, and it's usually a lot, like 26 seats a lot. That's been the average gain since the end of World War II. So that's why right now political polling site Project 538 predicts Republicans have a 4 in 5 chance, or an 80% shot, of taking control of the House. The Cook Political Report rates 33 seats as toss-ups that could go either way. The districts you see listed right here. 23 of those are currently held by Democrats and 10 are held by Republicans. And those will most likely be the ones that decide how power shifts in the House. So just 6 races in the Senate and 33 in the House could be the deciding factors in what the rest of President Joe Biden's term looks like. Control of the Senate is particularly important for things like federal judge appointments. We saw that this summer in how important the makeup of a court can be when the U.S. Supreme Court overturned Roe versus Wade, sending the issue of abortion rights to the states to decide. And because of that, abortion is on the ballot in this election. Here's where it's being voted on and what those votes mean for the future of abortion rights. After the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in June that abortion is not a constitutionally protected right and sent the issue to states to decide, moves were made around the country. Trigger laws went into effect in 13 states, banning abortion almost entirely in most cases, as early as 6 weeks after conception, when many people don't even know they're pregnant yet. Now, in response to these things, abortion is literally on the ballot in 5 states, and it's already been directly voted on in another one. In August, voters in Kansas overwhelmingly rejected a change to their state constitution that would have plainly said it does not protect the right to abortion. In this election, a similar amendment will be voted on in Kentucky. Right now, Kentucky has a near total abortion ban in effect. It's being challenged by the only abortion provider in the state, but it's still in effect until that court case is decided. Whether the amendment passes or fails, abortion access will still depend on how the court case comes out. And in the meantime, abortion is effectively banned in Kentucky. If voters don't pass the amendment, it could pave the way for the state's highest court to invalidate that ban. In Montana, voters will decide on a different abortion question. The issue on the ballot is whether to require medical treatment specifically for infants born alive after an attempted abortion. Montana's former Democratic governor vetoed a similar bill in 2019. Medical professionals opposed to this issue argue that it's not necessary and that the scenario of a baby being born alive after an attempted abortion is incredibly rare. Regardless, in Montana, abortion is legal before viability, which is generally about 24 to 26 weeks after conception. In Michigan, we're seeing a voter-initiated ballot measure that would change the state's constitution to guarantee abortion rights. Its supporters needed 425,000 signatures to get it on the ballot, and they collected 750,000. Now, there hasn't been a voter-led issue like this on ballots in decades, and this one is particularly important because Michigan still has an abortion ban from 1931 on the books. It came back into effect with the Supreme Court's overturning of Roe versus Wade, but then the ban got put on hold while it's being challenged in court. So if voters pass this constitutional amendment in Michigan, it means abortion rights are protected and that ban goes away. And if voters reject this amendment, the status quo continues until the court case on the abortion ban is settled. And in both California and Vermont, voters will decide on constitutional amendments that would establish a right to abortion in their states. Now, abortion is still legal in both of those places, and even if the amendments fail, that's not going to change. But they are expected to pass easily in both places. Even so, abortion rights supporters say they need to act now to make sure that remains the reality. No matter where you live, there are lots of important things on the ballot in election 2022. And in almost half of the states, there have been laws passed in the past 2 years that make it harder to vote. But voting is your right as a U.S. citizen. So here's what you need to know to be prepared in case that right is challenged by anyone on Election Day. When it comes to making sure your vote counts on Election Day, it's important to know your rights. Since the beginning of 2021, 21 states have enacted 42 laws that make it harder to vote, like cutting back on early voting, adding requirements to register and stay registered, and making it tougher to vote for people who show up to the wrong precinct. That's not even counting laws like the one stopping people from handing out food and drinks to voters waiting in line to cast their ballots. Now, we can't control that kind of voter suppression in the short term, but legally speaking, on Election Day, no one can try to stop you from voting. Let's break down how to set yourself up for success, what's not okay, and what you can do if someone does try to interfere with your right to vote. Vote.org is an incredible resource where you can check your voter registration status, find your polling place, and confirm what kind of identification you need to have with you in your state, all before heading out to cast your vote. If for some reason you get to your polling place and an election official tells you that you aren't eligible or you don't have the required ID, then you can request to vote on a provisional ballot. Now, this should be a last resort, but if your only option is to vote provisionally, make sure you call your county board of elections as soon as possible and ask if you need to provide any additional information, like proof of ID, to make sure your vote is counted. Remember, as long as you're in line before polling places close in your state, you have to be allowed to vote. Stay in line, though, because if you leave the line, you may not be allowed back in. And it's never okay for anyone to try to intimidate, coerce, or threaten you while you're trying to cast your ballot. If you experience issues while trying to vote on Election Day, you can call or text Election Protection, a national nonpartisan group that defends voting rights, at 1-866-OUR-VOTE. That's 1-866-687-8683 for help in English. They also have lines for people who speak Spanish, Arabic, and Asian languages. Their volunteers can help you get past any barrier to making your voice heard. I cannot stress enough what a great resource Vote.org is and how helpful election protection can be if you do find yourself in a situation where someone is trying to mess with your right to vote. Now that we have a broad overview of what's at stake in these midterm elections, let's end on a lighter note. Let's take a look at why Election Day is always in the first part of November. Have you ever wondered why Election Day is always on a Tuesday in early November? Legally speaking, now it's because there's a federal law that requires it. It's Chapter 2 of the U.S. Code, Section 7, and it guarantees that Election Day for federal offices falls between November 2nd and November 8th, depending on the calendar, in even-numbered years. That happened in the late 1800s, partly to streamline voting around the country and stop elections held at different times in different places from influencing each other based on their results. But why a Tuesday? And why in November? The answer isn't based on any complicated legal idea. It's based on religion and farming. In the 1800s, most Americans were farmers, and holding elections in November didn't interfere with their autumn harvests. It also avoided making people travel in winter in the bitter cold. Speaking of travel, a lot of these farmers lived far away from their polling places. That meant most people had to travel at least a day to cast their votes. Making it a Tuesday rather than a Monday avoided religious complications for people who didn't travel on Sundays, the holy day of rest for most Christians. And it was also important back then to make sure Election Day never fell on the first day of the month, even if that was a Tuesday, because the first of the month was an important bookkeeping day. That's when merchants balanced their books from the previous month. Now, there's never been a federal law in the books about when elections have to be held for state and local offices and issues, but most places stick to using the federal election date because it's just easier. And that's why, all these years later, Election Day is always on the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November. Farming and religion. Who knew? All right, thanks for being with me for this special Election 2022 edition of Legally Speaking. And if you like this show, keep an eye out for more, because we just dropped a student loan debt relief special, and we have plans for a lot more to come. Have a great Election Day, everybody. Get out there and vote.